everybody. So now we're going to move on to the very last step. That's putting the buttonholes on the front of the shirt. So if you can look over here, here's what the buttonholes look like when they're finished. They go lengthwise, parallel in the same direction as the long direction of the very front of the shirt band. And now on women's shirts are going to have the buttonholes on the right side. As you are wearing it, this is my right hand. Here's the right side of the shirt. So this is where the buttonholes are going to go on the lady's shirt. Those of you who are making a shirt for a woman, this is where the buttonholes are going to go on the right side as you're wearing it. If you are making a shirt for a man, the men's shirt, the buttonholes go on the left side. Okay? So I want to show you how to do a few things. I want to show you how to space and mark the buttonholes, prepare a sample to do the buttonhole on your machine, and then lastly, I'm going to show you on my machine how to do a buttonhole automatically using the sewing machine. Your machine might be a little bit different than mine, so you are going to have to look at your owner's manual or go onto the web and see if you can find a tutorial that instructs you how to do the buttonholes for your machine if it's different than the Brother CS6009. Okay? So these are the buttons that I'm going to use for this shirt. It says on the package how big the button is. This is a 3/4 of an inch button, which is a little bit on the large size. Your pattern envelope tells you to get buttons that are 3/8 of an inch, which is a little bit closer to this size over here. If you can see, I'm going to put my ruler right up against that, and you can see actually this button is about 1/2 inch. I would suggest getting a button that's either 1/2 inch, 5/8, or 3/4. Smaller than that, and it's going to be very hard to button the shirt, and you're going to have to do a lot of buttonholes to make it look proportionally correct. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to mark a line that goes right down the center of this area here. So remember, this is the man's shirt, so I'm doing my buttonhole markings on the left side of the shirt as if I were to be wearing it on my left side. So the first thing you need to do is you need to measure the distance between this top stitching line and this top stitching line, and then you're going to divide that in half. So if you look over here, I'm going to use centimeters just because this measurement is pretty tricky. I tried to do it with inches. I'm going to turn my ruler around so you can see. So with inches, this is about 7/8 of an inch from here to here, which is a little too complicated for me to do the math on. However, if I flip my ruler around and I use the centimeter side, I can see that from this line of top stitching to this line of top stitching is about 2 1/4 centimeters. It's a little bit easier for me to eyeball 1 1/8 centimeter, which is half of 2 1/4. So whatever the distance is from here to here on the top of the top stitching, on whatever side of the shirt you're doing your buttonholes, you're going to divide that by half, and you're going to do some marks. So 1 1/8 is right about here. I'm going to do another mark again about a hand space away, a little bit further down, and you're going to go all the way down to the bottom hem of your shirt, doing your marks halfway between these two lines of stitching. So now that we've used our friction pen to mark one aspect of the buttonhole placement, we're going to use it again to mark the other aspect, which is the distance between the buttons. So this is really a matter of personal preference. It has to do with the size of your buttons. It also has to do with the size of the wearer too. This is for my husband, who's a pretty tall guy. So if I do too many buttons too close together, it's going to look a little bit fussy on him. So I'm going to use 3 inches as my guide. I'm going to space my buttonholes 3 inches apart. You can do 2 inches if you are a petite person and you have small buttons. 2 1/2 is another good measurement. Between 2 1/2 and 3 inches, I think is, that's generally what I use. For the shirt that I'm making for myself, I'm going to use 2 1/2 inches, but for the shirt that I'm making for him, I'm going to use 3 inches. So maybe that could be our guide. 3 inches if you're doing a shirt for a man, and 2 1/2 if you're doing a shirt for a woman. So what you want to do is you're going to put your 3-inch mark right up here, right where the neckband meets this line that we just drew, right down the center of our buttonhole area. And then at the very bottom of the ruler, I'm going to do a crosswise mark like this. This marks the beginning of the buttonhole. The buttonhole is going to go from here down to, roughly about here, whatever the size of your button is. Now, on the automatic machine that I have, I don't need to mark the bottom of the buttonhole. I just need to mark the beginning. If your machine requires you to, you may have to mark the bottom of the buttonhole, but again, you're going to check your instruction manual and see what your machine calls for. Once I've marked my first buttonhole, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put my 3-inch mark right where that buttonhole beginning is. And now at the very bottom of the ruler, I'm going to do another crosswise mark, and this marks the beginning of my next buttonhole. So all the way down to about 4 or 5 inches from the very bottom, the hem of the shirt, you are going to mark the beginning of each of your buttonholes for the automatic buttonhole attachment on your machine, and I'll show you how we're going to set that up. So once you've marked the buttonhole placement, if you want to, you can put your buttons just to see what the spacing is going to look like. So again, the top of the buttonhole is what we have marked. So that's pretty much the spacing of the buttons. Before we move on, you may mark the buttonhole for this upper section for the neckband. You don't absolutely have to unless you think you are going to be buttoning the top of the shirt collar, maybe to possibly wear it with a tie. This is pretty hard to sew. I don't often have success on the machine just because this is a pretty thick area, but I'm going to show you how to do it just in case you want to. You think that the person who is going to wear the shirt might wear it with a tie and will want to close that very top button. So unlike the buttonholes on the front band of the shirt, which go lengthwise, this buttonhole goes kind of crosswise. It goes in this direction that I'm showing you right here. So we'll mark the length of it, which we're going to do the same way that we did mark the length of this, which is to measure the neckband. Mine measures about 1.25 inches. So 1/2 inch and a quarter is 5/8 of an inch. So that's this line right here. A little hard to see, I know. Again, I'm using a different marking material. I'm using this kind of wax chalk. Like the friction pen, the line will disappear when I press on it. So that's what you want to use. Anything that has any material that's going to disappear when you press. Okay, so this is pretty much the length, or in the direction at least, that I want this buttonhole to go. And I'm going to mark the beginning of the buttonhole the same way we used the friction pen to mark the beginning of the buttonholes here, which will be right about there, somewhere between like a 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch from the very end in this direction of the shirt collar. And I'm just feeling, sorry, not the shirt collar, the neckband. And I'm just feeling where I can feel my all my seam allowance on the inside stops, because that's what tends to make this be a little bit more problematic in sewing, is that the interfacing underneath here can be kind of thick.
So you don't line it up with these?
No.
You just measure over?
You just measure over.
How much?
Ideally as little as possible.
Okay.
Anywhere between 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch. Okay, and so that's going to be my button on the neckband going in this direction, and then the buttonholes, sorry, this is going to be my buttonhole on the neckband going in this direction, and then the buttonholes on the shirt front go in that direction.
So that's where the buttonhole starts?
Correct. This is the start of the buttonhole, and again, on my machine, I don't need to mark the end of it. Your machine, you might have to, so please look at those instructions. And now lastly, we're going to mark where the buttonholes go on the cuff. Okay, so this is what your finished cuff should look like. This is the house section of the placket. So this is the overlap. This is where your buttonholes are going to go. So I'm just going to lay this out. The buttonholes will go in this direction, like that. They should start about a 1/2 inch over from this finished edge of the cuff, going in that direction. So I'm going to put my ruler, the 1/2 inch mark, right up against that finished edge of the cuff, and I'm going to draw a line. And now it's up to you whether you want to do 2 buttonholes here or 1. Maybe you could take your buttons and see what it looks like. If I did 2 there, how would that look? Again, I feel like my buttonholes are kind of big. I'm sorry, my buttons are kind of big, so I think I might just do 1 buttonhole. So in that case, what I would do is I would take my ruler and I would measure the size of this cuff, which is about 2.5 inches. Half of that is 1.25 inches. So I'll do a mark at 1.25 inches, which is right here. So again, I can measure up from the bottom, 1.25 inches. If you wanted to do 2 buttonholes, you could either divide this by thirds, or maybe just measure up from the bottom edge a 1/2 inch, and then maybe another inch up from that. But it really is, it's a matter of preference. As long as the buttonholes are going in this direction and not in the up and down direction. And you will mark 1 cuff, and then you'll do the same thing to the other cuff. So we know, again, this is the beginning of the buttonhole, and that's pretty much where the button itself is going to lay, and I like that. Before we move on to learning how to do the buttonholes using the sewing machine, you want to prepare a sample bit of fabric so that you can test and make sure that your buttonhole is the right size and that your machine is working correctly. So you want to take a piece of fabric, any little bit of your scrap fabric, okay? This is a little extra section that I had here. Also, you need a little scrap of your interfacing, okay? The section that we're going to sew the buttonholes onto of your shirt is made up of 2 layers of fabric and 1 layer of interfacing. So I'm going to take my interfacing, I'm putting the pebbly side down onto the wrong side of the fabric. Now I'm just going to fold this layer of fabric over just to press it. I'm kind of using the fabric itself as a press cloth. So what I have right here is 2 layers of fabric and 1 layer of interfacing. It's really, 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 really important that you do a sample before you attempt to do your buttonhole, because this is a finished garment. The buttonholes are very small stitches, little zigzag stitches. They're really hard to take apart. So just for your own safety, peace of mind, make a sample, okay? And you're just going to draw a little T shape. Okay, so you can use any measurement you want, 1/2 inch away from the edge, 1 inch, whatever works for you. Okay, so this is where I'm going to do the buttonhole. This is going to be the beginning of the buttonhole, and it's going to go down in that direction. Okay, so now we're ready to do our sample buttonhole. So I'm going to show you how to use this machine here. This is the Brother CS6000i. I think it's one of the more common machines, and it makes a great buttonhole. It's worth it for me just to do the automatic buttonhole on this machine. So let me show you where the stitch is over here. So these are the different buttonholes that are programmed into this machine. There's number 29, 30, all the way through 35. The easiest and most successful is this one right here. This is stitch buttonhole number 30. So to change this setting on your sewing machine, you're going to go up here. Hopefully you've already figured out how to use this. This first button over here controls the tens column, and the second button over here controls the ones column. We really only need to change the tens column, so I'm just going to plus this button. It has plus and minus kind of incised into it. I'm going to plus it until I get to 30. If you wanted to use a different stitch, if you wanted to use stitch 31, 32, you can play around. You can do samples. You would just, again, plus the other column just to change that number. But I'm going to do buttonhole number 30. So that's what it looks like here. It's the simplest, it's the most successful, and I change it up here. So once your sewing machine is set to the buttonhole stitch that you want to use, the next thing that you want to find is this is a presser foot. This is actually a buttonhole presser foot. This comes with your machine, and the reason we need to use this is because this tells your sewing machine how big to make the buttonhole, and it's determined by the size of your button. So we're going to put the button into this section up here, and I'm just going to push it all the way up so that I have this big holder right here, and then I'm just going to press it down so that the button fits nice and tight right in there. And so this button on this presser foot tells your sewing machine how big to make the buttonhole. That's why we only need to mark the beginning of the buttonhole, because the sewing machine knows where to end it. So now I'm going to show you how to attach this presser foot onto your machine. To do that, I'm going to turn the machine around so that we can be looking a little bit more from the side and actually the back of the sewing machine. And again, if you have discovered this already, this little black finger that kind of sticks out right there, that's what we use to change the presser foot. If I push it in, the presser foot, the old presser foot drops right off. And I was using this foot, the N foot right here, and if you look on this foot, you can see how there's a bar right there, and if you look on this buttonhole foot, there's a bar right there as well. So what I want to do on this sewing machine is I want to line this bar up. If we can look underneath here, way down there, there's a little bump right underneath the very front of that presser foot attachment lever. What I'm going to do as best I can is I'm going to line the bump up with that bar. I need to go a little bit further up here. You can even maybe lift up the presser foot a little bit higher. And once you feel like it's lined up pretty well, then you can very gently lower the presser foot. And once it's really lined up correctly, it's just going to snap right into place.
There we go.
Okay. You'll know that it's properly connected when you go to lift up the presser foot if the whole buttonhole foot comes up with it. So now my buttonhole foot attachment is on and I'm ready to do my sample. So the sewing machine is going to sew your buttonhole from beginning here, ending there. So if you look at this kind of T shape, what you need to do is you need to line this T shape, the center of the T right here, into the center of this part of the presser foot. So in the center of this part of the buttonhole foot right here, there's a green line that goes in this direction and kind of red line that goes in that direction. Think of it almost like a cross beam, crosshairs. So you want to try to line up the T shape that you've drawn on your sample and on your shirts with those crosshairs right there. So the short part of the T, the beginning of the buttonhole should line up with the green line here, and then the longer part of the buttonhole, the direction actually needs to be, you're gonna try to look around inside here because there's an opening in the plastic part and the center of the buttonhole. See, I'm a little bit stuck here. There we go. The center of the buttonhole really needs to be as much as you can exactly in the middle of that white plastic part of the presser foot, so that when you lower it down, I'm just going to even it out just a little bit more. When you lower it down, it should look like that. Is it right straight in the center? And then just come on over here so you can see how it lines up with that, with the green cross beam. Before we start sewing, I'm going to show you another really cool thing about this sewing machine, okay? To make the buttonhole, this machine knows when to stop better than you do. So what we're going to do is we're going to disengage the foot pedal. And the way to do that is you're going to come around to the side of the sewing machine right here, and you're just going to pull that cord so that you don't have the white cord connected to your machine anymore.
Which is the foot pedal.
Which is the foot pedal. The white cord connects to the foot pedal. So now, if we come back to the front of the sewing machine, this button right here, which you never knew what it was for and didn't quite know what to do with, that becomes your on and off button, okay? So I'm going to start with the needle in the fabric. So we've used this button before, so I'm going to press that needle down button. And if you press this button, whatever your speed setting is up here, the sewing machine is going to sew a really nice even rate of speed. It's going to stay at that speed. If you press the button in, the machine will start sewing, and if you press the button again, it will stop sewing. Now, I made a mistake. I pressed the button in, but there was one more thing that wasn't connected on this buttonhole foot. So let me show you what that is. I'm going to raise up the needle, and we're going to turn the machine a little bit more. Okay, and you're going to see over here on the side of the sewing machine, there's this funny little lever. This has to be lowered down. Once your buttonhole foot is on, please try to remember. I forgot, and that's why the sewing machine wouldn't let me sew. So this lever lowers down. It's always tucked up underneath here. Again, another thing that you weren't quite sure what was for. We're going to lower it down, and it just kind of backs up to this little white plastic post that's sticking up from the buttonhole foot. And that's another thing that controls the size of your buttonhole. Really, really important. You won't be able to make a buttonhole if you don't do that. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the beginning here. Okay. My sewing machine accidentally turned off while I was doing that, so I just reset my stitch, my buttonhole stitch. Again, I'm going to start with the needle down, so I'm going to press the button. That lowers the needle, and now I'm going to press my start button. I'm not stepping on the gas. I'm not doing anything. If I press the button again, it will stop. So if it feels like it's getting away from you, you can press the button again and it'll stop. But if I press the button again, it'll start right where it left off. So it's going to do one long side of the buttonhole, and then it's going to do some stitches that go across the buttonhole, and then it's going to do the other long side of the buttonhole. And I'm not doing anything. It's just the machine knows how big to make the buttonhole because we've put the button itself, we've loaded it up into the back of the machine. Again, I'm not pressing anything. The sewing machine knows when to stop. That's why I find it to be very useful to not use the gas pedal, to use the stop and start button. Okay, once the machine stops, press your needle up button, lift up the presser foot, and you can pull your buttonhole away. I'm just going to cut some of those threads here. And look at that. I mean, that is, I'm just going to turn this over, cut it from here. I mean, it's gorgeous. It doesn't get any better than that. It's a beautiful buttonhole. So once you finish doing your buttonhole sample, bring it over to your ironing board and press it just to flatten the stitches. Also, you notice you'll make your mark go away, that friction pen. I cannot stress enough, only use a friction pen to mark the placement of the buttonholes. Once it's marked, once it's pressed, then what we need to do is we do need to cut the buttonhole itself open. I like to use a seam ripper. I start very carefully, and you're just going to push the seam ripper. I like this little skinny one, and I'm just going to do just a little bit of a push just to kind of rip the fabric in between those zigzag stitches that the buttonhole sewed. Once I rip it enough so that I can get my little scissors in here, then I'm going to continue cutting the buttonhole itself open with my little scissors. So that's why these little scissors are so handy. So I'll start from one side, cut it open, and then try to get that other edge. And so once it's sliced open like that, you'll see it might look like it's going to fray, but it's only going to fray just a little bit until it gets to this zigzag stitch. That's the whole reason why we do the buttonhole, so that when we slit the fabric to put the button in, it doesn't continue to fray and make a mess. And then the last thing you want to do, just make sure that your button is going to fit into your buttonhole. So we'll just kind of push it in like this, all the way through. Oh, look at that. Perfect fit. Okay, so now we're ready to do it for real on your shirt. Both of these sewing machines are set up with the buttonholes, one for the men's shirt and one for the women's shirt. So if you're doing the men's shirt, you are going to have the bulk of your shirt facing away from the sewing machine, because the machine is going to start at the beginning of the buttonhole and go to the end. And to orient it correctly, you're going to have the least amount of shirt here and the bulk of your shirt going away from the rest of the shirt, going away from the sewing machine, because the buttonholes for the men go on the left side. Whereas on this shirt here, this is the women's shirt, the buttonholes are on the right side. So for the sewing machine to start at the beginning of the buttonhole and go to the end, you're gonna always have the bulk of your shirt in this small inner section of the sewing machine. So please be very careful when you sew, because this gets very kind of messy and complicated, so that you're always starting your buttonhole where you have your mark, and remember it's going to end where the sewing machine knows to stop. Okay, so just like you did your sample, we're ready to do the shirt. We've lined it up correctly. We know that the men's shirt, we're going to have most of the shirt facing away from the sewing machine. The women's shirt, you're going to have the shirt section right in here on the sewing machine. We've lined up the green crosshairs at the very beginning of the buttonhole. I'm making sure that the rest of the buttonhole, that lengthwise direction, is right in that little cutout in the white plastic section. Start again with the needle down. Once the needle is in the fabric, I can press my go button. I'm going to stop it just for a second, and I'm going to cut some of these threads, just so that they don't get stuck afterwards. And then I'll start it up again. Okay, keep your eye on it. Make sure that it doesn't get stuck. Sometimes they do get stuck in a little bit of a spot and it makes a little bit of a jam. So just always watch. Keep your eye. Don't walk away from it. Keep your eye on what your machine is doing. Great. Once the sewing machine stops sewing, do the needle up, pick up your presser foot, and now I just kind of slide the whole thing away from me, and I look for my next cross mark, lower my presser foot, check around the back, make sure that it's right along the center, and keep going. Do that to all your buttonholes. And then one last thing, I'll show you how we're going to do the cuff buttonholes. So we're going to line it up. Again, this shorter part of the T is going to line up with the green cross mark there, and we're just going to make sure that the longer T that goes in the same direction, that round direction of your cuff, is going to be right in the middle of that white section, that opening of the buttonhole foot. So same as when we did the buttonholes on the front of the shirt, you'll do the same thing. You'll start with the needle down in the fabric, and then whenever you're ready, you're going to press your go button, and your sewing machine is going to know what size buttonhole to make. So when you're finished with your buttonholes, you've pressed them, you've cut them open, the last step now is to line the two sides of the shirt, the left and the right, up so that we can position the buttons. So the way I do it is I lay the shirt out nice and flat on the table so that I can line up these center front edges. And what I try to do is, see that line of top stitching there? I'm trying to line it up with the line of top stitching that's underneath it. Okay, so that this interface section is laid over the other interfacing section that's below, that's underneath this. So I'm going to line up the collar up here, and I'm going to line up the hem down there, and right where the opening of the buttonholes are. So this is why it's important that you slice the buttonholes open. I'm going to put a pin in, and I'm going to push it out. Okay, so I'm pinning right where that opening of the buttonhole is. I'm going to do the same thing to this one here. So what I'm going to do is I am using the pins to simulate where the button would be. I'm just taking a little bit of a bite out of the layer down here, the underneath layer, the layer that's below where the buttonholes are. And that's going to tell me where I'm going to position my buttons. So after you do this, what you're left with is a row of pins that go down on this opposite side of the shirt. So it's a little bit tricky to do any hand stitching when we have so many pins here. So we're just going to put some marks right where the center of that little pin bite is. And again, I'm going to use my friction pen, maybe do a little X that follows the pin, and then cross into that. Okay, so again, I'm pressing the friction pen right on the hard surface of the pin, and then I'm just going to do an X in the middle, just a little crosswise mark right in the middle of that. So now I know exactly where the center of my buttons will be, and we're ready to move on to the very last step, which is hand sewing. We're going to sew these buttons on by hand. So once you've finished doing your X marks right where the pins are, you can take them out, and these X marks tells us right where we're going to be sewing the buttons on by hand. So let's do that now. So now you're going to get your hand sewing needle, put the end of the thread through the eye of the needle, and same as we did in class, we're going to use a double thickness of thread. So I'm going to match the ends of my thread, just like that. And I'm holding the thread in my left hand, pointing up about an inch, and I'm also holding the needle in my right hand, pointing up about an inch. I'm going to take my pointer finger away. I'm going to lay that inch of thread on my pointer finger, and I'm holding it down with the needle. Now I'm just going to wrap the tip of the needle with that thread that's in my left hand about 4 or 5 times. I'm going to slide it down so I hold on to that business that I just wrapped. I'll let go of the thread with my left hand. My left hand is going to take the tip of the needle, and it's going to pull it from in between my fingers, and that business that I just wrapped around is going to become my knot. So I'm going to keep pulling and pulling. It's going to get a little bit funky looking right here, but that eventually is going to pull all the way through until it becomes this big giant knot right here, which is okay. So now I'm going to hide this knot underneath. This is the right side of the shirt. So now I'm going to put the needle in so that it goes into the wrong side of the shirt, into the underneath part of the shirt. And I want to make the point of the needle come out right in the middle of that X mark that I just drew. And now I'll pull the thread out. I'm going to pull it so that that knot that I made comes right to the very, very tight up against the back of the shirt. Now I've got a 2-hole button, so I'm going to make my needle go into the underneath part of the button. I'm going to push it out, and then I'm going to make it go into the top part of the button and push it out again. So I am taking a bite of the button, just like that. And then I'm going to make my needle go back down into the fabric from the right side, coming out the wrong side. And I'm just going to pull that thread until my button pretty much lays flat up against my shirt. I'm ready to take another stitch. So now I'm going to start underneath again. I'm going to take another bite. And now this when it gets a little bit hard, I want to try to push the needle out through one of those holes. Doesn't really matter. And I'm going to pull the needle once I get it out from that hole. Okay, now before I make another stitch, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to take a toothpick. Hopefully you all have a toothpick at home. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to push the toothpick, if you can see underneath this button, I'm going to push it right in between those stitches. What I want to do is I want to make this button not super flat up against that layer of fabric. Because if I do, then there won't be any place for the part that I'm buttoning around to fit into underneath. So that's what the toothpick does, is it gives me a little bit of space underneath the button. And now I'm ready to continue stitching. So I'm going to push the needle in from the top of the button and pull it. And now I'm going to do another stitch. So again, I'm going to start underneath and push the needle so that it goes out through the hole. Pull it, and now I'm going to push the needle in so it goes into the hole on the top. So you're going to continue this process, I don't know, maybe about 5 or 6 times. So underneath, come out through the hole, pull it, and then from the top down into the hole and pull it. So you're always going in and out the holes. Try to be very careful that you don't accidentally go in the incorrect hole. So once you've done this about 5 or 6 times, we're ready to finish off. So what we're going to do is we're going to come from the underneath part of the shirt, and I'm going to push the needle out. But now I'm not going to go into the hole. I'm just going to push the needle out so that it comes between the fabric and the button. I'm going to remove my toothpick. And now what we have is we've got a little bit of a space here right underneath the button, and I'm going to use the thread to wrap around. Underneath the button, I'm wrapping around those strands of thread that I used to attach the button to the shirt. Do it a whole bunch of times, like maybe 10 or 12 times, so that you make a nice, we're just corralling those threads so that we make a nice stand for the button to stand away from the shirt with. And now I'm going to push the needle back in to the underneath part of the shirt all the way. Okay, and then I'm going to make another knot here. I'm going to make the needle go underneath all of these threads and pull it until I see that little loop. It looks a little bit tangly there, but I think that's the loop. Yeah, I'm going to push my needle into the loop and pull it tight. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. Another knot just for insurance. Pull that through, underneath that loop, into the loop and grab it, nice and tight. And there we have the buttons. So now I can cut all of these threads. Those initial loops you'll see really don't matter. Okay, and that's what your button looks like. So there's a little bit of space underneath the button. If you can see that. See that little bit of space underneath the button? Great, so that's what we want. We need to have a little bit of a space under the button for the other side of the shirt to attach onto. So congratulations! You're finished with your shirt. Enjoy wearing it. Nobody's gonna believe you made it because it came out so great. Good job, everybody.